They offered him a job as their driver. In a house worth $14 million, in a room full of New Orleans' finest, his wife's mother stood before 200 guests and announced that the quietest man in the room needed their charity. She smiled when she said it. She expected applause. She got it. What she could not have known, what none of them in that glittering ballroom could have known, was that every inch of ground beneath that house, every brick in the tower on Poydras Street, every property bearing their family name in this city already belonged to the man they were pitying. He had inherited a $3.2 trillion empire from a father who never once told him it existed. And now, with a letter sitting on his kitchen table and a black notebook on his bookshelf, the sleeping giant was finally awake. The question is not what he did when he found out. The question is how precise he was when he finally moved. If this story has you leaning in, hit that like button right now and subscribe so you never miss what we drop on this channel. And let us know where you're watching from today. Drop your city in the comments. We've got people tuning in from New Orleans, Atlanta, Houston, Memphis, and everywhere in between. Now let me take you back to where this started, to a garden party in the Garden District, to a woman who believed she was being generous, and to a man who absorbed the insult, tucked it away, and began counting. The Thibodeau estate sat on Prytania Street like a declaration. It was not simply a house. It was a statement. White columns, wrought iron, live oaks older than the neighborhood's memory, the kind of property that made people slow their cars just to look. Nadine Thibodeau had made sure of that. She had spent 40 years maintaining the place with the precision of someone who understood that image was its own form of currency. And tonight, for her 70th birthday, she had done what she always did when she wanted to remind this city of exactly who she was. She had filled every room. Elijah Monroe arrived at 7:15 in a charcoal grey suit he had pressed himself. He came through the front door with Camille on his arm and immediately felt what he always felt when he entered this house, the specific, familiar pressure of being the wrong kind of man in the right kind of room. Camille moved through the crowd like she had been rehearsing for it her entire life. She had been. The pearls, the posture, the way she greeted Nadine's friends with 2 kisses, and her best smile, all of it was muscle memory from a childhood spent preparing for exactly this. Elijah smiled when he needed to. He shook hands when they were extended. He said little, which was fine, because no one was particularly interested in what he had to say. Beau Thibodeau found him near the bar at 7:45. Beau was Camille's cousin, 42 years old, barrel-chested, the kind of man who moved through rooms, assuming the space would part for him. He had his father's forehead and his mother's mouth, which meant he led with confidence and followed with condescension. He clapped Elijah on the shoulder hard enough to constitute a statement. "You make it through the week?" Beau asked, flagging down the bartender. "Long week," Elijah said. "Teaching, man." Beau shook his head with the practiced sympathy of a man who had never once considered the profession. "What grade?" 11th, American History. Beau picked up his drink and looked out at the crowd. "Nadine's been talking about you," he said, and the way he said it carried the tone of a man passing along a warning he didn't particularly feel responsible for. Elijah said nothing. Dinner was set in the main ballroom, 22 round tables, the good china, a jazz quartet playing from the corner near the French doors that opened to the rear garden. Elijah sat beside Camille and ate his food and listened to conversations he had no stake in. He watched the room. He watched Nadine at the center table, holding court with the effortless authority of a woman who had never once been told no by anyone who counted. The speeches began at 9. Nadine's oldest friend spoke first, then a business associate, then Beau, who delivered a tribute that was mostly a list of Nadine's accomplishments presented as if they were also, somehow, his own. Then Nadine herself rose, and the room fell into the kind of hush that happens when people are genuinely afraid to cough. She was beautiful in her composure. She thanked her guests. She spoke about legacy and family and what it meant to build something worth leaving behind. And then she paused, and her eyes found Elijah's table. "I want to take a moment," she said, "to acknowledge my son-in-law, Elijah." He looked up. Around him, heads turned. He felt 200 pairs of eyes settle on him like something physical. "He's a good man," Nadine said, and the warmth in her voice was perfectly calibrated. Generous enough to seem genuine, measured enough to make clear she was doing him a favor. "And because he's family, I want to make sure he feels truly supported. Starting this fall, we're creating a household coordination position, overseeing the family's transportation needs and the day-to-day operations of the estate. I'd love for Elijah to take that on." She smiled. The room applauded. Camille looked at her champagne glass. Elijah sat very still. His face did not change. He did not look at Camille. He did not look at Beau, who was already raising his glass with a grin. He looked at the white tablecloth in front of him and breathed carefully through his nose and held the whole of it inside himself, the way his father had taught him to hold things, with his chest, not his face. Later he stepped out to the rear veranda and stood in the September heat with his hands in his pockets. That was when he remembered the letter. It had arrived Thursday in a thick envelope, certified, addressed to him specifically. The return address read Monroe Heritage Trust Legal Partners, Poydras Street, New Orleans. He had tucked it into his coat pocket to read later, and then the day had swallowed him whole, and later had not come. He reached into his pocket now and found it. He turned it over once in the dark, feeling the weight of it. It was heavier than he expected. He thought about opening it right there on the veranda with the jazz bleeding through the French doors and the oak trees filtering the streetlights into something soft. He put it back. He went inside and collected Camille and said his quiet goodbyes and drove home. And that letter, tucked back in his jacket pocket, would sit on the kitchen table for 3 days. 3 days of ordinary life. 3 days of early mornings and corner store coffee and 60 papers about the Reconstruction era waiting to be graded. 3 days before everything changed. They had met 6 years ago at a school board gala that Camille's firm had organized, and Elijah had been dragooned into attending by a colleague who bailed at the last minute. He remembered thinking she was the most beautiful woman he had ever seen, standing beside a catering table. She remembered thinking he was serious in a way that most men weren't. They talked for 2 hours. She called him the next day. He was surprised enough by this that he almost didn't pick up. Their courtship was 2 years long and genuinely sweet, and when Elijah proposed, he did it at his father's kitchen table in Gentilly, with Clarence Monroe sitting right there, which Camille later told her friends was the most romantic thing she had ever witnessed. Clarence had pressed Elijah's hand once and said only, "She's good." He died 11 months later. The wedding was at Second Zion Baptist in the 7th Ward, the same church where Elijah had been baptized at 8 years old, where his mother's casket had rested at the front of the sanctuary when he was 19, where Clarence Monroe had sat in the same third pew for 42 years. The reception was at the Thibodeau estate because Nadine had insisted and because Camille had let her, and it was beautiful, and Elijah had been grateful and uneasy in equal measure. The unease never fully left. The Thibodeau family had not opposed the marriage. They had simply absorbed it as a condition they were managing. Nadine's strategy was refinement by proximity. If Elijah could not be made presentable, he could at least be made less visible. She never said anything directly cruel. She said things that cut cleanly and left no mark. "Elijah, we'll take the town car and you might want to park in the back." Or, "The Boudreau family is coming and Raymond is still in investment banking, isn't that something?" Or at a dinner 18 months into the marriage, turning to Elijah with genuine seeming interest and asking, "Do teachers still get summers off? That must be so freeing." Beau operated at a lower altitude. His version of contempt was casual, the offhand remark, the nickname that never quite settled into warmth. He called Elijah the professor in a tone that turned the word into a diminishment. He made suggestions that Elijah look into property management, into logistics coordination, into any of a dozen careers that Beau considered more appropriate to what Elijah owed the family name he'd married into. Camille listened to all of it and did nothing. This was the thing that lived in Elijah's chest like a stone, not the Thibodeau family's contempt, which he had anticipated and could manage, but his wife's silence, which he had not anticipated and could not explain away. He had told himself stories about it for 4 years, that she was protecting him by not escalating, that she was managing her mother in ways he couldn't see, that her love was real even when her courage was absent. He had believed those stories because he needed to. He still believed them. The truth was simpler and harder than any of the stories he told himself. He had chosen Camille. He had chosen her fully, with his eyes open, knowing her family came with her the way weather comes with a city. He had told himself that love was a practice, not a condition, that it required maintenance, endurance, the willingness to stay when staying was not comfortable. His father had told him that a good marriage is built like a good house, slowly, on the right foundation, with materials that don't look impressive but hold up in a storm. What Elijah had not accounted for was the possibility that the foundation wasn't his. He had grown up in Gentilly, 2 blocks from the levee, in a house where Clarence Monroe left for work before sunrise and came home after dark, and never once, in Elijah's entire childhood, explained exactly where he went. Elijah had assumed an accounting firm. He had assumed modesty. He had assumed a man who wore second-hand suits and clipped coupons and refused to own a credit card was a man without resources. He had never assumed anything else. What he knew of his father was the domestic reality. The morning grits with butter on Sunday, the gospel radio low enough that it didn't wake the neighbours, the way Clarence read the newspaper from back to front, and always started with the obituaries. He knew his father was calm in the way deep water is calm, not still, but settled. He knew that Clarence Monroe had never raised his voice at anyone in Elijah's memory, and that the few times Elijah had seen him angry, it had manifested as a long, patient silence that frightened people far more than shouting would have. Clarence died on a Tuesday in March, 3 years ago now. The funeral was at Second Zion. The church was full in a way that surprised Elijah. Men in expensive suits he didn't recognize, a woman in a charcoal blazer who arrived alone and left before the repast, a row of older men near the back who wept in the particular way of people who have lost something they cannot replace. Elijah had noted all of it and filed it under grief's strangeness and moved on because grief will make you see patterns that aren't there, and Elijah had too much to carry already. He had been carrying it for 3 years. He still went to Gentilly sometimes, to his father's house, which he'd kept and couldn't quite bring himself to sell. He'd sit in Clarence's chair by the window and feel the weight of the neighbourhood, The neighbors who knew his name, the corner store, the particular quality of the light through the live oaks in the afternoon. It felt like something that could not be translated into any other language. Elijah had learned early that a man who loses his patience loses his advantage. And he had never once lost his patience with the Thibodeau family. What sustained him was something he couldn't quite name, a feeling passed down from his father that the ground beneath him was more solid than anyone else knew. He had meant to open it. Thursday. Then Friday passed, Saturday was the party, and Sunday was for grading papers at his kitchen table, with the radio on low, trombone shorty, then some old Irma Thomas, then a gospel set he let play through twice because the morning felt like it needed it. Monday evening he picked up the envelope. He sat at the kitchen table and opened it with a butter knife, which was the kind of man he was. Methodical, careful, unwilling to tear things. Inside was a formal letter on cream-coloured stationery, 3 pages, and a business card clipped to the top. The card read, Renard Turode, Senior Partner, Turode and Associates. The letter began, Dear Mr. Monroe, we are writing to inform you that as the designated sole beneficiary of the Monroe Heritage Trust, established by the late Clarence Monroe on November 14, 1992, your formal activation of beneficial ownership has been pending for 3 years following Mr. Monroe's passing. Elijah read it once. He set it down and looked at the kitchen wall for a moment. Then he read it again. The language was dense. Trust law, beneficial interest, activation thresholds, subsidiary controlling stakes. He was a history teacher. He understood the architecture of language well enough to follow the argument, and the argument he followed was this. His father had built something enormous. The letter used the figure $3.2 trillion in assets under management twice, once in the body and once in a footnote, as if the writer understood it required confirmation. He stood at the kitchen window for a moment. The street outside was quiet. A cat moved along the opposite sidewalk, and a porch light 2 houses down clicked off. The Treme neighborhood did its nighttime settling, the old wood of these houses contracting in the evening cool. Elijah had lived on this block for 6 years and knew its sounds the way you know the sounds of your own breathing. He went to the bookshelf. Elijah got up from the table, walked to the bookshelf in the study, and retrieved the black notebook. He had not opened it in years. It was still in the same condition as the day his father pressed it into his 12-year-old hands. Plain black leather cover, worn soft at the spine, a rubber band around the middle that had long since lost its tension. He had always told himself he'd decipher it someday. Someday had kept not arriving. He sat back down at the kitchen table and opened it. The first page was dated March 1989. The handwriting was Clarence Monroe's, precise, vertical, the script of a man who had learned penmanship in the era when it was still taught as a discipline. Numbers ran down the left column, names ran down the right. Law firms, account numbers, a string of property addresses in New Orleans that Elijah did not immediately recognize. On the 3rd page, Meridian Capital Group. On the 7th page, Crescent Development LLC, followed by 4 New Orleans addresses. Elijah looked at the 4th address. It was 3614 Prytania Street. He looked at it for a long time. That was the Thibodeau estate. He turned back to the letter and reread the paragraph on subsidiary holdings. Crescent Development LLC, a Meridian Capital Group subsidiary, held title to a portfolio of New Orleans properties operating under long-term management agreements. The managing parties were listed in a footnote. The 4th name was Thibodeau Family Holdings, LLC. Elijah set the letter down. He sat at his kitchen table in the Treme on a Monday night, and looked at the water glass in front of him and felt something move through his chest that he had never felt before. Not grief, not anger, not even satisfaction, but something older and slower and more final than any of those things. His father had known. Not just known. His father had engineered every inch of this with the patience of a man who understood that the best plans are the ones nobody sees coming until they are already complete. For 22 years, the Thibodeau family had been operating their entire empire on the foundation of a trust that belonged to Clarence Monroe's son, and for 4 years they had been treating that son like a nuisance. Elijah picked up the business card. He held it between his fingers and looked at it the way a man looks at something that changes the coordinates of his life. Then he set it on the table beside the letter and the notebook and the butter knife and went to bed. In the morning he called the number. It rang twice. A calm, measured voice answered and said, "Turode and Associates, good morning." Elijah said, "This is Elijah Monroe. I received a letter about the Monroe Heritage Trust. I'd like to come in." There was a brief pause, and then the voice said, with the particular quiet warmth of someone who has been waiting a long time for a specific phone call, "Of course, Mr. Monroe. We've been expecting you." The office was on the 14th floor of a building on Poydras Street, the kind of floor you reach by appointment only, where the elevator requires a key card and the receptionist knows your name before you say it. Elijah arrived in his teaching clothes, pressed khakis, a blue Oxford, brown Oxfords he had polished the night before out of some instinct he couldn't name. He carried the black notebook and the letter in a manila folder. He sat in the waiting area and looked out at the city, the river brown and wide, to the south, the Superdome pale and enormous, the neighborhoods spreading out in every direction, like a quilt someone had been adding to for 300 years. Renard Turode came out to meet him himself. He was 58 years old, trim, silver-haired, with the kind of unhurried precision that comes from decades of knowing exactly what he was doing. He wore a dark suit and no tie and shook Elijah's hand with both of his, the grip of someone who understands that some meetings are not ordinary meetings. "Mr. Monroe," he said, "I'm glad you came." They sat in a conference room with a long mahogany table and a view of the river. Renard poured coffee without asking. He placed a folder on the table, thick, organized, tabbed, and then he folded his hands and looked at Elijah. The way you look at someone before you say something that will rearrange their life. "Your father was a remarkable man," Renard said. "I worked with him for 21 years. In that time I watched him build something with a patience and a discipline that I have never seen equaled in this business. He was not interested in recognition, he was not interested in display, he was interested in building something real, and he was interested in leaving it to you." Elijah said, "Why didn't he tell me?" Renard considered this. "He told me once that he wanted you to become yourself without it. He said that knowing about the money too early would change how you understood your own life. He wanted you to know who you were before you knew what you had." Elijah was quiet for a moment. He thought of Clarence in his chair by the window in Gentilly. He thought of second-hand suits and Sunday grits and the gospel radio kept low. Then he said, "Tell me about Crescent Development." Renard opened the folder. For the next 40 minutes, Elijah received an education. Meridian Capital Group, founded 1987, had grown through disciplined private equity investment over 35 years into a $3.2 trillion entity managing assets across 14 sectors. All of it, every subsidiary, every holding, every trust, traced back to the Monroe Heritage Trust, of which Elijah was sole beneficiary. The activation process required him to sign a series of documents, Once activated, he would assume full controlling interest. Then Renard turned to the subsidiary index and found Crescent Development LLC. He said the name calmly, the way you say the name of something that has been waiting in plain sight. He opened a second binder and placed it in front of Elijah. The pages were organized by property category: commercial holdings, residential holdings, mixed-use portfolios. Each property had a file card, address, assessed value, current operating entity, terms of the management agreement. Elijah turned pages. He recognized street names. He recognized the stretch of Magazine Street where the Thibodeau family had their commercial strip. He recognized the riverfront block that Nadine had once described, with unmistakable pride, as the family's greatest investment. He turned one more page and stopped. He walked Elijah through the property ledger page by page. 47 New Orleans properties, commercial, residential, mixed use. Long-term management agreements with various operating entities. Renard pointed to the line, Thibodeau Family, Holdings LLC. He pointed to the addresses. He pointed to the management terms. 22 years of operating agreements, renewal options exercised twice, all fees current, all documentation intact. They have been operating these properties, Renard said carefully, under agreements that originate with Crescent Development. They do not hold title. They hold management rights under a long-term agreement. And under the terms of the Crescent Development Charter, the controlling party, which will be you once you activate, has the right to terminate those agreements with 90 days' notice. Elijah looked at the address for 3614 Prytania Street. He looked at it for a long time. And their credit structure, he said. Renard turned a page. Their primary operating loans are collateralized against the management agreements. When the management agreements are threatened, the collateral is threatened. Their primary bank, First Crescent National, would be required to freeze their credit lines pending resolution. That is standard procedure. Silence sat between them like a third party in the room. Then Elijah said, "What are my options?" Renard reached to the side and slid a second folder across the mahogany table. Thinner, cleaner, organized with the precision of a man who had been preparing it for 3 years. "Every option you could want is in there," he said. "Take it home. Read it carefully. Call me when you're ready." Elijah looked at the folder. He picked it up. He placed it inside the manila folder beside the black notebook and the letter. He finished his coffee. He thanked Renard Toureau and shook his hand and took the elevator back down to Poydras Street and walked to his car and sat behind the wheel for 4 minutes without starting the engine. Then he drove home. He did not grade any papers that night. He sat in his father's chair, the one he had moved from Gentilly to the Treme after Clarence died, the one that still smelled faintly of the old house, and he read every page of the folder twice. By the time he finished, the patience he had been carrying for 4 years had transformed into something else entirely. It had become precision. He did not tell Camille. He had learned from watching his father that the most important things a man does are the things he does without announcement. Clarence Monroe had built a $3 trillion empire without once mentioning it at dinner. Elijah could keep a plan for 6 weeks. He called Renard on a Wednesday morning from his car parked behind the school while the hallways were still quiet. He said, "I want to move forward." There was no dramatics in Renard's response, just the measured calm of a man who had been in this business long enough to understand that when the right person finally makes the right decision, you do not celebrate it, you execute it. They met 3 times over 2 weeks. The first meeting was procedural. Elijah signed the activation documents, 26 pages tabbed and organized, witnessed by 2 members of Renard's staff. When Elijah set down the pen after the last signature, Renard said quietly, As of today, you are the controlling beneficiary of the Monroe Heritage Trust. Nothing changed in the room. The light was the same. The city was the same. But something that had been dormant for 3 years was now awake. The second meeting was strategic. Renard laid out the sequence on a single sheet of paper, which was all it required. Step 1. Monroe Heritage Trust issues formal management transfer demands for Crescent Development LLC, activating the controlling interest transfer clauses built into the original charter. This would trigger automatic property freeze provisions in the management agreements. Step 2. Trust banking partners issue collateral calls against Thibodeau Family Holdings' outstanding operational loans, citing the transfer demand as a material change in the underlying agreements. Step 3. Hold. Watch. Let the legal machinery do its work before making any further move. The final step, the confrontation, would come later, on Elijah's terms, in a setting of his choosing. Every action would be taken through the trust's attorneys. Nothing would trace to Elijah directly. They will investigate, Renard said. When the freeze notices arrive, their attorney will try to identify the controlling party. The trust's structure will require 3 to 5 business days to unravel to your name. By that time, the freeze will already be in effect. Elijah nodded. The third meeting was brief. Renard showed him the draft notices. Elijah read them. He asked 2 questions about the timeline. Renard answered them precisely. Then Elijah said he was ready. The notices were mailed on a Thursday morning. Elijah was at school by 7:15, the same as every other Thursday. He walked his hallway. He unlocked his classroom. He set up his lesson. The Reconstruction Amendments, the broken promises, the long story of what happens when power pretends not to see what it is doing. His third period class was sharp that day, and one student, a girl named Destiny, who sat in the second row and argued with primary sources like they were living people, said something about constitutional architecture that made Elijah smile for the first time in weeks. He stopped at the corner store on the way home, bought his usual, a cup of coffee and a newspaper and a small bag of cashews that he ate in the car before going inside. He sat at his kitchen table and graded papers until 9. He watched the news. He went to bed. He said nothing to Camille about any of it. There were moments that week when she looked at him across their dinner table with something like suspicion, not formed enough to be an accusation, more like a noticing. He met those moments the way his father had taught him to meet difficult moments, with stillness, with the face of a man who had nothing to hide, which was technically true. He was not hiding anything. He was simply waiting for the right time to show it. On Friday evening, she mentioned that her mother had called 3 times and seemed agitated about something legal. Elijah looked up from his book. "Did she say what?" he asked. "Something about the properties." "I don't know. She's probably overreacting." He nodded and went back to his book. On Saturday morning, he drove to Gentilly and sat in the empty house for an hour. He looked at the place where his father's chair used to be. He looked at the kitchen where the grits had been made every Sunday morning for as long as he could remember. He thought, "This is what you built for me, old man." He drove home and sealed the last outgoing envelope from Renard's office that he had picked up on his way back. He drove to the postal box on Rampart Street and dropped it in. He stood there for a moment with his hand still near the slot. For the first time in 4 years, he felt like a man standing on ground that no one could take from him. Because it was. The letter arrived at the Thibodeau estate on a Tuesday morning. It came certified, addressed to Thibodeau Family Holdings LLC, return address a law firm in the CBD that Nadine did not immediately recognize. Her housekeeper placed it on the breakfast room table with the rest of the mail. Nadine opened it with her reading glasses and her coffee, and the casual authority of a woman who assumed every piece of correspondence was ultimately beneath her concern. She read it once. She set it down. She read it again. The language was formal and dense, but the meaning was not complicated. The Monroe Heritage Trust, as controlling party of Crescent Development LLC, was initiating a management transfer pursuant to Section 14B of the Crescent Development Charter. All Thibodeau family holdings management agreements were hereby frozen pending the completion of the transfer. No property transactions, no new encumbrances, no disbursements from the operating accounts. Nadine called Foster Blanchard at 9:15. Foster Blanchard was the Thibodeau family's corporate attorney. 60 years old, silver-haired, the most unflappable man Nadine had ever hired. She had seen him stare down auditors without blinking. The first thing she noticed when he called her back at 10:40 was that he sounded careful. The second thing she noticed was that he did not immediately tell her this was a mistake. "The Monroe Heritage Trust is a legitimate entity," he said. "I've verified it. They hold a controlling position in Crescent Development that predates your family's management agreements by 4 years. I don't know why they've been dormant until now, but they have the right to initiate this transfer." "Then fight it," Nadine said. "On what grounds?" Silence. By noon, Beau Thibodeau was in his own attorney's office in the CBD, his voice rising with each new piece of information. The legal position was clear. The Monroe Heritage Trust was not a ghost. It was real, it was funded, and it had every right to do exactly what it was doing. By 2 o'clock, First Crescent National had frozen the Thibodeau family holdings credit lines. It was not a decision the bank made lightly. It was a decision the bank made because the collateral underlying those credit lines, the management agreements, had been flagged as materially impaired. Their risk department had no choice. $70 million in operating capital gone cold, just like that. Beau tried to liquidate some personal holdings to bridge the gap. He got on the phone with his broker at 3 and discovered that his personal accounts, which he had believed were worth roughly $14 million, were actually worth 9, owing to some investment decisions he had made in the past 18 months that had not performed as projected. He sat in his car in the parking garage for a while after that call. Nadine called Camille at 4:15. "Is your husband involved in this?" she demanded. Camille said she had no idea what her mother was talking about. She came home that evening and stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at Elijah, who was at the table with a cup of coffee and a stack of essays, red pen in hand. "My mother thinks you're connected to something involving the family's properties," Camille said. "Some kind of legal action?" Elijah looked up. His face was the same face it had always been. Patient, settled, the face of a man who had never given her a reason to doubt him. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said. She looked at him for a long time. She went to bed without saying anything else. But the look she gave him before she left the kitchen was the look of a woman who was beginning to understand that she had spent 4 years in a house with someone she had never fully known. And she was right. The Thibodeau Centre was 42 stories of glass and steel on Poydras Street, the crown jewel of the family portfolio. Its anchor tenant was the Beaumont Grand Hotel Group, a 15-year lease, $12 million annually, the deal that had funded the family's last decade of expansion. On the third Wednesday, after the freeze notices arrived, Beaumont Grand's general counsel called Foster Blanchard and invoked force majeure. The clause was buried in paragraph 19 of the lease. It allowed the tenant to terminate the agreement if title to the underlying property became materially disputed. It was the kind of clause that corporate attorneys insert because they are paid to imagine disasters. This was the disaster. Foster Blanchard sat with the lease for 2 hours looking for a counter. He did not find one. The credit line was gone. The anchor tenant was gone. The family's attorneys filed an emergency injunction in Civil District Court to halt the management transfer on Thursday morning. The judge denied it by Thursday afternoon. The story broke on Friday. A business reporter at the Times-Picayune had been tipped to the freeze filing. Court documents are public record, and someone who attended the denial hearing had talked. The headline was measured but accurate. Thibodeau Holdings Properties frozen in trust dispute. By Saturday morning, it had been picked up by 2 Houston real estate newsletters and a national business brief. Beau Thibodeau had announced his city council candidacy 6 weeks earlier to considerable fanfare. His 3 largest donors, a hotel developer, a Tulane-connected foundation, and a local construction group, called within 48 hours of the story's publication. All 3 withdrew. Beau spent the better part of that afternoon on his phone, trying to patch the damage, calling names on a list he had spent 3 years building, with late dinners and campaign contributions. The calls did not go well. Men who had answered on the first ring for years were suddenly in meetings. Assistants took messages that would not be returned. Beau called Nadine from his car. Nadine was simultaneously on the phone with Blanchard, who was telling her the injunction strategy was exhausted, with a publicist who was telling her the story was moving too fast to contain, and with the Thibodeau Center's manager, who was telling her that 2 additional tenants had sent emails asking about the status of their leases. On the following Tuesday, a civil court filing formally removed Nadine Thibodeau from the Crescent Development Board of Directors. The Monroe Heritage Trust's attorneys had initiated the board action as the first step in the formal management transfer. It was administrative. It was quiet. It ran on the local evening news as the second item in the business segment. Nadine's phone stopped ringing the way it used to. The invitations slowed. The lunch calendar, which had never had an empty week in the 4 years Elijah had known the family, began to open. The women who had orbited Nadine Thibodeau for decades, some from genuine affection, most from the gravitational pull of her influence, found reasons to be elsewhere. Camille moved back to the estate. She told Elijah it was to help her mother. She packed a bag on a Sunday evening and stood in the hallway of the house they shared and looked at him with the complicated expression of a woman making a choice she knew was the wrong one but could not yet stop making. He looked back at her with the same patient eyes he had always had. "Okay," he said. He watched her car leave from the front window. He ate dinner at his kitchen table that night with the newspaper and the radio, Irma Thomas, because some nights required it. He read the business section. He saw the item about the board removal. He folded the paper neatly and set it beside his plate. In 3 weeks, the Thibodeau family had lost $180 million in leveraged value, their anchor tenant, their political future, their board positions, and every social ally they had ever paid to keep. There was one thing left. Elijah had been waiting for it since the night he stood on the veranda with a letter in his hand. He called Camille on a Saturday morning and said, "I need us all in the same room. One time, can you make that happen?" She asked why. He said, "Because there are things your family needs to hear from me directly, and I'd rather say them in person than have them read about it in the paper." There was a long pause. Then she said yes. Elijah dressed carefully that Saturday afternoon. He wore the same charcoal grey suit from the birthday party. He polished his brown Oxfords. He put the black notebook and the letter from Renard's office in the inside pocket of his jacket, where the birthday party letter had been on the night it all began. A symmetry that felt right to him, though he did not say it aloud to anyone. He drove to Britannia Street alone. The estate looked different in October than it had in September. The live oaks had darkened. The iron fence needed painting in one corner, a detail Elijah had noticed many times before and noticed now with different eyes. He parked at the curb and walked to the front door and rang the bell. Camille let him in. The house was quiet in the way that houses become quiet when the performance stops. No jazz quartet, no catering staff, no 200 guests filling every room with the particular noise of people trying to impress each other. Just the house itself. The high ceilings, the portraits on the walls, the scent of old wood and fresh flowers, and the particular smell of a home that has been lived in for a long time by people who believe it will always be theirs. Nadine and Beau were in the sitting room off the main hall. Nadine sat in the high-backed chair she always occupied, the one that faced the door, the one that positioned her above the sight line of everyone who entered. Her composure was intact, but it was the composure of a woman holding something together by will alone. Beau stood near the window with his arms crossed. He had aged several years in 6 weeks, which is what happens to men who have never been refused anything and are then refused everything at once. Elijah sat down. He placed the manila folder on the coffee table between them and did not open it yet. He said, "I want to tell you about my father." Nobody spoke. His name was Clarence Monroe. You met him once at my wedding, and I don't think any of you remembered him by the time the reception ended. He wore a suit he had owned for 15 years. He ate from the buffet line with everyone else. He left early because he didn't like crowds. Elijah paused. He also founded Meridian Capital Group in 1987. He spent 35 years building it into a $3.2 trillion private equity firm, and he left all of it to me. Beau shifted his weight. Nadine's chin rose slightly, a small, reflexive gesture of defiance. Beau said, "That's not—" "The black notebook," Elijah continued, as if Beau had not spoken. "The one he gave me when I was 12, account numbers, addresses, law firm names. I kept it on my shelf for 32 years because he told me one day it would make sense. It made sense 6 weeks ago." Nadine's face was very still. Crescent Development LLC is a Meridian Capital subsidiary. It has held title to every property in your portfolio since 1999. You have been operating this estate, the Thibodaux Center, and 45 other properties under management agreements that originate with a company that belongs to me. You have never owned any of it. He said this without anger, just as information, delivered with the care of a teacher making sure the lesson lands. For 22 years, my father's trust has been the silent foundation of everything your family has built. You just didn't know it. Nadine found her voice. "This is a fraud. This is some kind of—" "It is not a fraud," Elijah said. "Ask Foster Blanchard. He's known for 6 weeks. That stopped her. "The management transfer is proceeding. That is not a negotiation. It is a legal process that is already underway. What you need to understand today is who initiated it and why." He looked at Nadine directly. "You offered me a job as your driver. You did it in front of 200 people. You did it with a smile. You had been doing versions of it for 4 years, and every time you did it, Camille said nothing and I said nothing. And you took our silence as confirmation that your assessment of me was correct." Nadine opened her mouth. "I am not finished," Elijah said quietly. She closed it. "You were not correct. You were never correct. You spent 4 years measuring a man by the wrong instruments, and because you were so certain of what you were seeing, you never once considered what you might be missing." He turned to Beau. "Your campaign is over. That is not a consequence I planned specifically." It is a consequence of your family's financial structure, which was built on agreements that are now terminated. I want you to understand the difference. I did not target you. You were simply in the path of something larger than any of us." Bo said nothing. His hands were very still. Elijah looked at Camille last. He had rehearsed nothing for this part. "Wishin loved you," he said. It was simple, and it was true, and he said it without apology and without accusation. "I would have done anything for this marriage. I endured 4 years of your family's contempt because I believed that what we had was worth enduring for. I still believe you are a good person. But every time your mother reduced me in public, you chose to look away. Every time Bo made his suggestions, you smiled at the table. You made a choice every single time, and I need you to know that I saw every one of them." Camille's eyes were wet. She did not speak. The room was very quiet. Outside, a car moved slowly up Prytania Street, its headlights sweeping briefly through the tall windows. The portraits on the walls, 4 generations of Thibodeau faces, painted in the flat confidence of people who believed they would always occupy this house, looked down at all of them with expressions that could no longer be read as authority. Nadine made a sound that was not quite a word. Bo put his head down. He said nothing. There was nothing left to say. Elijah opened the manila folder and removed a single document, a deed transfer notice for 3614 Prytania Street, signed and notarized with a 90-day vacate provision under the new management structure. He placed it on the coffee table. He stood up. "You have 90 days. Renard Tureau at Tureau and Associates is the contact for any questions about the transition. His office will be fair." He looked at the room one final time. The high ceilings, the portraits, the house his father's trust had owned for 22 years. "You spent 4 years treating me like someone who needed your charity. You stood in this room and offered me a job driving your cars like you were doing God's work. But what you didn't know was that every room in this house, every brick in that tower downtown, every property with the Thibodeau name on it, you were living in mine." He picked up the manila folder and walked to the door. He opened it. He walked through it. Behind him, he heard Nadine begin to cry, not with grief, but with the particular shattered sound of someone realizing all at once that everything they believed about their life was built on something they never actually owned. He did not turn around. The door of the Thibodeau mansion closed behind Elijah Monroe with the quiet, final sound of a verdict. No one would appeal. The movers came to Prytania Street on a Wednesday morning in January. Nadine had not left quietly. She had left the way she lived, with declaration, with the performance of dignity even when the dignity itself was gone. She had chosen a rental in Metairie rather than any of the other options available to her, and if New Orleans society had an opinion about that choice, it expressed it the way New Orleans society always has, through what it stopped saying and stopped inviting. Bo withdrew from the council race in November. A short statement, no press conference, a brief paragraph on his campaign website. He returned to work at a mid-size commercial real estate firm in the CBD, a firm that did not have his name on the door and never would. His colleagues were polite and did not mention Crescent Development. The divorce was filed in December. Elijah's attorney prepared the paperwork and Elijah reviewed it once and signed everything without modification. He took nothing from the marriage except the furniture that had been his before the wedding, the books from the study shelves, and his father's chair. He left the joint accounts untouched for Camille. He did not want a settlement. He wanted to leave cleanly, and he did. He moved into a townhouse in the Treme, 2 bedrooms, a courtyard in the back, a kitchen with enough room for a proper Sunday breakfast. The neighborhood was the one he had always felt most like himself in. The neighbors knew his name. The corner store was 3 blocks away. He returned to teaching in January. The first morning back, he unlocked his classroom before any other teacher arrived. He set his coffee on the desk and stood at the whiteboard and wrote the day's lesson topic in his careful, vertical print. The handwriting he had inherited directly from Clarence Monroe, the same hand that had filled the black notebook 35 years ago. 3 students stopped him in the hallway before first bell to say they were glad he was back. He thanked them. He meant it. He taught Reconstruction again and found he had new things to say about patience and strategy and the long, careful work of building something the world wasn't ready to see yet. His students could not have known why he was different that semester. They simply sensed it. That quality of a man who has arrived at something and is no longer waiting to begin. The Foundation's administrative offices were on Poydras Street in a building 4 floors below Renard Touros. Elijah had chosen the location deliberately. He liked the idea of passing through the lobby every week. The same building where he had first learned what his father had built, now housing something he was building himself. In February, he established the Clarence Monroe Foundation. The first class of scholars was 40 strong, all first-generation college students from New Orleans, all chosen by a committee that Elijah had assembled with care, all given full scholarship support, plus a stipend for books and housing. Elijah wrote the letter to each recipient himself on cream-colored stationery, with his father's fountain pen. The letter did not mention money. It talked about patience. It talked about building things that outlast you. It closed with a sentence Clarence Monroe had said to Elijah once, standing in the Gentilly kitchen on a Sunday morning over grits and gospel radio. "The best work is the work nobody sees you doing." 8 months after the confrontation, at a school board meeting on a Tuesday evening in September, Elijah sat down next to a woman he had not met before. She had a notebook and a coffee, and she was marking up a facilities report with the focused efficiency of someone who took their work seriously. Her name was Vivienne Arsenault. She worked for the city's school district. She had grown up in New Orleans East, went to Xavier, had been doing this work for 11 years. They talked for an hour after the meeting ended. Vivienne asked about the foundation. Elijah told her about it. She asked what inspired the name. He told her about Clarence, the Gentilly house, the second-hand suits, the gospel radio, the morning grits, the man who spent 40 years building something his son didn't know existed. She said, "He sounds like someone I would have wanted to know." Elijah nodded. He was. He paused. He was the quietest person in any room he ever walked into, and somehow he was always the most important one there. I just didn't know it until he was gone. She asked about the black notebook. He had mentioned it in passing, and she had caught it the way perceptive people catch the important details in a story. He told her about it. The account numbers, the addresses, the law firm names, the sentence his father said over a kitchen table when Elijah was 12 years old. She said, "I'd like to see it sometime." He looked at her. She had the same quality of attention his father had possessed, the quality of someone who is genuinely present, who listens to the whole sentence before forming a thought about it. "I'd like that," he said. He called his mother's oldest friend on the way home, an aunt figure named Delphine, who had known Clarence for 60 years and had never liked the Thibodeau family from the first time she heard about them. She picked up on the second ring. He told her briefly how it had ended. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Your daddy always said the patient man gets to write the last chapter?" Elijah said, "Yes, Mom." They talked for a few minutes about the foundation. Then she told him to eat something and said good night. He drove home that night along the river road, the water dark and wide to his left, the city lights strung along the bank. He thought about his father. He thought about the notebook, and the letter, and the white envelope in his coat pocket, and the moment on the veranda when he had chosen to put it back and wait. He had been waiting his whole life without knowing what he was waiting for. True power, he understood now, is not what you display in a room full of people who are watching. It is what you hold quietly inside yourself when no one is looking. The foundation that endures beneath every storm, the deed that outlasts every argument, the love a father builds for 40 years and leaves in a plain black notebook on a shelf, waiting for the right moment to be opened. Clarence Munro had understood that a man's worth is not determined by the room that receives him. It is determined by the ground beneath the room, and he had made sure, quietly and deliberately, and with tremendous patience, that his son would always be standing on his. If you were in Elijah's position, what would you have done? Would you have moved as carefully as he did? Or would you have said something in that ballroom the night it happened? Let us know in the comments below. If this story moved you, hit that like button. It helps more people find this channel and hear stories like this one. Subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you in the next one.